Well, hello and welcome to Crime Talk, Charlie Crimebuster Crime Talk with James Buckland, our producer. He's going to be interviewing me, yours truly, Charlie Crimebuster, tonight, as we talk about the last episode that we just dropped, the Menendez Brothers breaking news. And so we're going to discuss that on today's program.
The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are solely those of the individuals interviewed or participating and do not represent those of Charlie Crimebuster nor Peacemaker Network. All individuals described or mentioned in the presentation should be considered innocent until found guilty in a court of law. This presentation contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener and viewer discretion is advised.
If you happen to be a new listener, we want you to hit that subscribe button, become a part of YouTube, our YouTube channel. Also, we encourage you to check out all the other platforms to see where we are. We'd like for you to be a part of that. And we'd also like for you to reach out with a shout out. Reach me, Charlie Crimebuster at gmail.com, charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. If you'd like to support us, where would they go, James?
They would go to peacemakernetwork.com, and there they can become a badge member for as little as $3 a month. That's badge, BADGE, and that's less than a penny a day. And that's peacemakernetwork.com. That's where we support our first responders, law enforcement, and military.
And we do that proudly, don't we?
Absolutely.
We do that absolutely proudly, no doubt about it. Also, if you'd like to get caught up on the podcast, we have several hundred podcasts out there, episodes, I should say, and we would love for you to get caught up on it. Just go over to charliecrimebuster.com, charliecrimebuster.com. Hey, James, before we get into tonight's episode, we just left an episode on I shot the judge, but I did not shoot the deputy. Mm-hmm. And we were talking, you and I, over the past week or so, and we also had some questions from people. And there was a real interesting question. Do you remember the question we talked about the cameras in the judge's chamber?
Yes.
Yeah. Why don't you bring that question and let me answer that for the folks, just to kind of go back just a little bit to add a little bit to our series on I shot the sheriff but did not shoot the deputy.
Well, as we covered in the episode, there were incidents that occurred in the judge's chambers prior to the sheriff shooting the judge. And so the question was posed, why weren't those cameras seeing that activity before the actual shooting?
And that's an excellent question. It really is. And, I had thought about that and I was going to share it with the folks, but we didn't really get the time to do that. But the answer is very simple. Prior to that deputy being charged with those charges of coercing and sexually assaulting an inmate there in the judge's chamber, prior to that, there were no cameras in there. And in fact, very few judges' chambers do I know that there are cameras, because there's a privacy, issue there.
Sure.
And it's his chamber. Now I do know there's a lot of cameras, in the hallway going to the judges' chambers and courthouses I've been in.
Yes.
And the access points and that sort of thing. But very, very rarely do you ever see cameras in the judges' chambers. But I think because of the fact that this happened in the judge's chamber where the deputy was sexually assaulting, and I say it's sexual assault because he coerced her. It really wasn't a consensual type of thing. He had power over her. Mm-hmm. So I think that's probably the reason why they put the camera there. But the answer is that those cameras were not there when those unfortunate incidents took place. Mm-hmm. Also. We just got a lot of good attention. A lot of folks seem to really like that last episode, or the last two episodes that we dropped on the podcast of I shot the judge but did not shoot the deputy. So we'll come back and visit that later on down the line when we know a little more about what's happening.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. Also, too, we wanted to introduce a way for folks can actually, instead of they don't have email and they actually are listening to us on their mobile device, they can actually text us now at 407-917-2211. That's 407-917-2211. And they can text us a response if they don't agree or disagree with anything that we're saying. It comes right to us.
That's fabulous.
Yeah. So we've got a way of
Yeah.
them texting us right
Yeah,
away.
we'll try to get ways of getting that out so people can have that and put it in their phone, hopefully, and join with us
Absolutely.
and become a part of the dialogue, right?
Absolutely. We
Yep.
encourage that. We want to hear from our listeners.
Yep. All right, let's get into tonight's episode, James.
All right. Well, you mentioned that you were surprised about the DA's announcement about the Menendez brothers possibly being set loose or being released. What was that, and why were you surprised?
Well, the announcement was that came just last week, and that's why we jumped on this particular podcast subject in this case very
Hmm.
quickly.
Hmm.
The announcement was that the Menendez brothers, who were convicted of a parricide. That's a term that you don't hear very often, but it
Hmm.
is a term in legal circles. Parricide, of actually killing their mother and father. They had actually been convicted for 30 years in a really high profile trial. And they had been in prison for 30 years. So, it's surprising. I mean, how many times do you see a district attorney? District attorneys are more so fighting to keep people in jail,
Right.
in prison, than out of prison. So I was really surprised that this district attorney in Los Angeles said, "Hey, I want to recommend resentencing for these guys." And it means a little more than resentencing. It also means that because they've been there 30 years, and because when they committed these crimes in the state of California, they were considered youthful offenders, not juvenile offenders now. Not
Hmm.
they were
Hmm.
still adults, 18 and 21, I think, when this happened.
Hmm.
But because of their age, they would, if they resentenced, he wanted them to be resentenced to 50 years. And right now they're sentenced to life without parole. He wanted it to be 50 years, and eligible for parole. But because of their early age when they committed this crime, then according to standards, they would be open, available to go before the parole board now because they've done 30 years. So literally, it's an opportunity for these guys to walk out of prison. So yeah, I was surprised. I was shocked, actually, because of that.
Right. Right. So, but why is he recommending this new sentence anyway? What
Well,
what
there's
what compelling reasons does he have to
Yeah, well,
bring this up?
he's saying a number of things. Number one, and I think what's overlying with this whole thing, he's saying that
Mhm.
what did come up at the trial was that the defense said that the both these brothers had been sexually assaulted
Right.
by their father, that they had been sexually abused by their father, emotionally abused by their father, physically abused by their father. And at the time of this particular trial, the DA is saying that the country wasn't very sensitive to that, and a lot of people just didn't believe that males could even be abused or sexually abused. And so he said that because of the evolution, because we've evolved in the last 30 years, that people are more sensitive to that now, and he thinks that ought to come to the forefront in considering the resentencing.
Uh-huh.
The two other things that he said is, number one is that one of the reasons why people go to prison is to be rehabilitated. And apparently, from what we understand, that these guys have been outstanding prisoners.
Hmm.
They haven't
Hmm.
got in trouble. They've actually tried to improve themselves, taken advantage of education. They've been involved in programs to help other inmates. And he said
Wow.
because of the fact that they've been rehabilitated. And then the third reason that he said in his statement was that one of the things you look at is, will this person offend again? Will this person be a danger to society? And it was his opinion that they would not be a danger to society, so that you could release them and let them go. Interesting enough, he has been involved. This seems to be kind of a platform that he's on out there, because he's been involved in about 300 of these cases where he sought for resentencing for people. And he
Wow.
says that a number of them have actually been released, and that very few of them have returned to crime. So that's
Wow.
pretty well where he is on that
That's good.
statement. Yep.
That's good. Well, based upon this new evidence and the fact that it's going to be heard by a judge, on deciding whether or not they get to be resentenced, does that mean that they could potentially go free?
Well, and let me back up a little bit too. Those three statements are fine, but I think there's also something to be considered that has to be considered in this debate that's going to occur because of this. I'm sure
Uh-huh.
is the fact that also I think that not only should we look at the rehabilitation and look at will there be a danger to society, but I think also there is a punitive part of this. I mean, there is it's called punishment.
Right.
And there are some people who say, hey, these guys. In fact, when this trial first came to being, they were seeking for the death penalty,
Right.
and they
Right.
did not get the death penalty, of course. But so there's another side to that. But the answer to your question is just because he recommends this sentencing does not mean that they're automatically going free. First of all, the judge has to act upon this recommendation. The judge could just say no.
Right.
I don't think they deserve resentencing. He could knock it right out right then. Though usually the judges pretty well go with, especially when it comes from a prosecutor.
Uh-huh.
The second thing is that even if the judge says for the resentence, and they do resentence them to 50 years, or 50 years, at least 50 years in life with the possibility of parole, then they would still have to go before a parole board.
Uh-huh.
And then a parole board would still have to
Oh,
vote and
okay.
decide whether this could be. So there's still several stages that have to take place before this. So I just don't see,
Uh,
the next week or two, or even before Thanksgiving, I don't think we're going to see them walking out free unless this thing accelerated very quickly, and I don't think it will that quickly.
right. Right. Yeah. But that makes sense that they have to go before a parole board.
Oh yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
and people will. I'm usually in these parole boards. People have an opportunity to come and oppose, and it was interesting to me. He said that even in his own staff of attorneys there in the Los Angeles areas, that his office was divided about this. In other words, there were people that were for it, and there were people that were against it.
Hmm.
And I think we're going to see that to be true. Down the line.
So to be clear, he's the prosecutor is not recommending commuting their sentences. In other words, forgiving it completely. He
No,
just wants
no.
them to be resentenced.
Resentence. They
Okay.
they were sentenced without the possibility of parole.
Ah, I see.
He wants
Okay.
them to have the possibility of parole, basically.
Oh, gotcha. Gotcha. That makes
Yeah,
sense now.
and
Well, now
even
tell.
even in parole,
Mhm.
if they are paroled, they're going to be under a certain standards that they have to keep up with, and maybe certain checks on them. I mean, when a person is paroled like that, there are that's why you have parole officers out there
Right.
policing
Right. Yeah.
parolees to
Right.
make sure that they're behaving according to a list of certain obligations that the court may say. For instance, sometimes when somebody's maybe there for a drug situation, then part of the conditions of parole may be that that you get drug tested
Hmm.
every now and
Hmm.
then. So there's
Right.
probably going to be some. If they do get a parole, there's probably going to be at least some standards there that they have to look at, and probably some times when the parole officer will be looking at them to make sure that they are really uh, coming back to society and going to make a difference in society if that happens.
Hmm. Right. So now tell us again why it's important to establish a timeline for these cases like
Well,
this.
often, James, in all of well, I guess just about all of our cases we cover, we always do a timeline. And I do that because of my past experience as an investigator, because one of the best ways to learn about a case is to set a timeline.
Hmm.
And boy, this timeline is really a doozy, as we say. And one of the things, for instance, when you look at a timeline, you can see the whole case. You can put it in context.
Hmm. Hmm.
And this one is what I call 7-7. When I say 7-7, it took 7 months before they became really suspects and arrested, and it took 7 years to get them convicted.
Wow.
These trials went on for 7 years, and so the timeline covers a great deal of years there, and so we shared a timeline so you could kind of see where we are, where it started at and where we are now. The other thing that a timeline does is it helps you to see the context of what's happening. For instance, there are several things that happened during this time. One thing was that even in the middle of one of the trials, the trial had to be suspended for a few days because that terrible earthquake happened out
Hmm.
there,
Right.
where
Yeah.
all kinds of people were dislodged and didn't have homes, and it was a terrible, terrible time. It was right after the Rodney King issue,
Hmm. Right.
where he was beaten by police officers. And get this, James, it was right after O.J. Simpson
Yeah.
trial. And so, in fact, there are some people that believe that really led to a plus in the prosecution side. And we're going to talk about this on our next episode about the trials. But just to kind of give the folks a little taste of why we do the timelines, is that there are people that say that because O.J. Simpson went free, that there was such a response from the American people about him going free that it really gave the prosecution an edge, because there are a lot of people that thought that Nicole did not get justice.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
they think, well, hey, we're going to make sure that these two people get justice. So
Yep.
kind of the opposite effect, in that
Wow.
situation. So that's again why we show the timeline, so that people can kind of look at it in context of what was happening during that day. And just to say that this crime happened, that they did this, and then they were convicted. I think people need to see what happened during the time. That's why we do the timeline.
But when they do that, when they pigeonhole them into something that they say that they have to convict them because of somebody else got free, isn't that really an unfair and unjust
Well, yeah, it is, and
approach?
and it, it's and it's and uh, it's really done unconsciously. It's not
Wow.
something where where the DA gets up and says, "Hey, O.J. Simpson went free. Don't let these guys free." That's all I'm talking about. It's just that in people's mind, you get to thinking. I don't know how you thought, but I thought, hey, I think it's terrible. I think there was so much evidence convicting O.J. Simpson.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
thought it was just really I think it was a terrible, terrible blow on justice that he went free. And so maybe the average person thinks that out there too in their mind. And even though they don't realize, it might kind of taint their minds unconsciously to try to push for a prosecution or push for a guilty fee or free. So it wasn't something that was adamantly outside and pushed, but it
Right.
was more of an internal thing that people say that people may have thought that in their mind, and the jury may have thought that as they went into it, even though they
Hmm.
may not have realized that it was in the back of their mind.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't mean to
Interesting.
get really psychological there, but
Yeah. Hey, it's just good to vet the possibilities. You never
yeah,
know. So,
yeah, but yeah, I read some research on it. Some people really think it had an impact.
wow.
And I think they said they did some studies and some trials and found that juries were more apt to give guilty fees after O.J. Simpson. That
Right.
there was some
Yeah.
kind of study done, but
Interesting. Wow. Well, let's just change the mood just a minute, for just a minute, and kind of remind us about this week's crazy crook story.
our crazy crook story, yeah, crazy crook story. Yeah. Uh, you know,
Uh,
folks, you don't have to ever worry about us running out of these stories because they just abound and abound and abound, don't they?
and can't make them up. Can't make them up.
This crazy crook, this what actually happened in South Carolina. Guy decided to go in and rob one of these quick stops. Walked in there, had a hoodie on, had a mask on, had a gun in his waistband, and he didn't ask him, demanded the money, and he walked out of there with $300. Well, this crook starts this crazy run pretty quick, because instead of getting far away from there, he just went down the street and started spending his money at a general dollar store. So
Hmm.
that shows he really didn't have a lot of it between his ears when he did that. And so the
Right.
police caught up with him. They caught him. But the thing that was really stood out in this crazy crook story is that when they caught him and they found the weapon that he had, it wasn't a real weapon. It was actually a Nintendo gun that is used in the Nintendo game Duck. And he had taken that gun and he spray painted it black.
Uh-huh.
Now, that gun was not going to help him any if he got into a shootout. It sure wasn't gonna. Yeah, he couldn't even really shoot a real duck with it, but that's what he did. But he thought he was smart, James, because he said to the officers and those folks that were bringing him in, said, "You guys can't charge me with armed robbery because it's
Yeah.
not a real gun." So, and
Right.
we know today that if you charge of armed robbery, there's a lot more teeth in the law. You're going
Yep.
to have a lot more time to face, and it's going to be a lot more serious. So he thought by just taking a toy gun in there, that he would get out of the charge of armed robbery. However, in South Carolina, there is a law, and a lot of states there's a law like this, that even if you use a fake gun, if in the mind of the person that you're confronting, if they think that it is a real gun, if they believe that their life is in danger,
Hmm.
then you can still be charged with armed robbery. And so, guess what? Our smart thief that thought he was being smart was not so smart. He was crazy because he got charged with armed robbery in that situation. So
Oh my word.
yeah,
From
so
from a
another
Nintendo duck gun, huh?
Nintendo duck gun. I always wondered, what if we got all these crooks together one day and just put them in the same room? Can you imagine what would happen?
Oh yeah. Oh my word.
Yeah. And by
Wow.
the way, let me just say, if you're listening to the program, our YouTube channel tonight, and you do have a crazy crook story that you'd like for us to share, we would love to hear about your crazy crook story. As I said,
Yes.
there's a lot of them out there. And if you have something that you think would be really interesting you'd like for us to share, just reach out with that shout out at charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. We'd be glad to take a look at your crazy crook story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But you mentioned the guy's alibi in your podcast. What's up with that?
Well, what basically happened was, on that night,
Hmm.
um, the Jose and his wife Kitty
Hmm.
were there in their home. It's a mansion. I call it the murder mansion because it
Hmm.
was a murder mansion.
On Elm
I
Street, of all
also
places.
I've also called this a nightmare on Elm Street
Yep.
because it was a terrible, terrible, terrible thing that happened.
Yep.
And they're sitting there. They're watching TV, and they're eating ice cream and berries. And these two sons of theirs walk in there with shotguns and just start blowing them away. I mean, you look at Jose was shot 6 times. Can you imagine being shot 6 times close range with a shotgun? You know, I mean, terrible, terrible, terrible damage to the person. Even blew part of his skull away. Their mother was shot 10 times, ten
Mm,
times
mm.
with a shotgun close range, and she was on the floor crawling away. And these guys went outside, got more shotgun shells, went back in, and continued to shoot her and shot her right in the face.
Oh.
So these are savage, graphic, real chaotic scene. In
Mm,
fact, police officers that were doing this particular crime scene, who were investigating it, these are trained police officers who've seen a whole lot of things happen,
mm.
and many of them said it was the worst crime scene they'd ever seen in their life. I mean, there was literally brain splatter on the wall. I mean, that's how
Oh,
terrible, terrible this thing was.
wow.
So the two guys then, they after they got through doing this terrible crime, they sat down on the steps outside their the murder mansion there, and they thought the police would just be right there. They thought the noise would just attract the police, but it
Hmm.
didn't. And so then they get thinking, well, hey, we may get away with this thing. And so they left. They went and took their clothes, bloody clothes, put it into a garbage bin somewhere.
Hmm.
They went several streets and away and buried the shotguns. And then they said, okay, let's start working on our alibi. And so they first of all went to the movies because they thought that'd be a good place to get an alibi, and they were going to get a ticket to the movie there. Batman was the movie, but they found that the ticket was time stamped, so they couldn't do that because that wouldn't go with their alibi.
Right.
So they ended up going to a wine tasting. Then they ran into a friend, and they went to the Cheesecake Factory. They tried to get their friend to go home with one of the brothers because he said he left his license because they thought that would be a good alibi. They were out eating with a friend, and then their friend comes with them and finds the dead parents there. But the
Mm.
friend didn't say, I don't need to go home with you, and so they didn't do that. So then they went back to the place. Then they established their alibi by going with their friend to the Cheesecake Factory. Established their alibi by going to that wine tasting, and then they called the police. And I mean, I've heard the recordings. I mean, they just emotionally they were distraught. They were just crying and really fooled the police. I mean, the police really thought that they were literally victims of this crime. That they
Wow.
were so tore away because some unknown person had come in there and killed their parents. So that's how they went about to establish their alibi for what happened there. And it was like 7 months before these guys were
Yeah.
arrested.
So when did they become real suspects?
Well, the first thing when what they were both taken to the police department that night.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, there was one mistake that the police made there. That was, I think, a really, really glaring mistake, because you always consider the family, because most people, when they're killed, they're basically killed by somebody they know or somebody in their family.
Right.
And so, what they failed to do is they did not test these guys for gunshot residue in their hand. Had they done that, there's no doubt in my mind that it would have revealed that these guys had handled a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
But they failed to do that. And I mean, and people say, well, you couldn't do it for a warrant. Well, there's a good way you could have done that. You could have easily said, hey, listen, we want to rule you out of this. We
Mm-hmm.
we know you don't do this, but let's not waste our time looking at you guys. Let's go look at the real culprits here. And so let us rule you out, and let us take, let's do the gunshot residue. Now, if they had refused that at that time, then that's a real good, it's a real good indication that these guys got something to hide.
Right.
Then
Right.
you could have got the warrant and you could have got it done. But they
Mm-hmm.
didn't do that. So they went back to the police station that night, and as they went back to the police station that night, one of the brothers said, that he thought that maybe this was a mafia hit. And the reason he said that is because Jose, their father, was a executive at RCA Studios, and part of one of the divisions there was actually a division of adult films. And when you get with adult films, pornography basically, when you
Mm-hmm.
get with that, you usually have mafia ties. And there was
Ah.
one guy who was a part of the mafia who was tied into that one division there that his father had worked with. And so he used that to plant that into the mind of the detectives, and the detectives actually really went and investigated that possibility that it could be the mafia.
Mm-hmm.
But now let me ask you, James. I mean, we've covered a lot of crime here on our program, and I just don't. I don't know many mafia hits that's like this.
Yeah.
Usually a
Mm-hmm.
mafia hit is much more precise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's shot to the back of the head with a 22 or something like that. You don't
Yep.
usually hear about mafia hits, guys going into shotguns and blowing up. If anything, this was overkill. But now, also in looking at this, they then began, of course, to talk to family and friends. And as they talked to family and friends, they found out one thing about Jose, that he was not a very liked person. I mean, the
Mm.
people that worked with him said he was a bully. They said he was rude. In fact, one of the guys that was a manager with him, he watched him dress down one of the mid-level managers, embarrass him in front of all the people. And when they were alone, he looked over to his friend. He said, I would rather be feared than loved. So this guy was a bully. This guy was not a very pleasant guy.
Mm.
And so the police said, there probably has a whole lot of enemies. And so they began to investigate a whole lot of people involved in this.
Wow.
But then now, they did not have they didn't have any fingerprints on there. They did not have the weapons there, so they were really foundering there. But they did notice one thing, that these guys really begin to spend money like mad. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
keep in mind that they got an insurance settlement from their parents. Um, They looked like they were going to get the will. There's even some stuff about the will that we'll talk about in the next episode. But they spent $700,000 in just those few months. And
Wow.
if you were to take that same rate of spending over a year, they would probably spend like 2 point something $4 million, you know. So then, that alerted the police, said, hey, maybe these guys, maybe the guys did this for the money, you know. Maybe they wanted that money. And so they began to look at him as a suspect when they saw this lavish spending that they were doing.
Right.
And then Erik went to a psychiatrist that they'd been seeing, and he couldn't stand it any longer, so he told the psychiatrist about it. The psychiatrist had had a mistress, and he told the mistress about it. And then, as you know, there's the old word that nothing like a scorned lover, right?
That's right.
And so he had had tapes of them confessing, and she went to the police. And when she went to the police, that opened this whole thing up to an investigation of the kids. Actually, the rest of them, even though I mean they probably suspected them prior to realizing that this psychiatrist had that confession.
Hmm.
On top of all that, even though they had an idea, they still didn't have enough evidence to get him. But when they found that there were tapes where they had confessed this, that gave them the probable cause for an arrest. So
Oh,
that's
wow.
how they became a suspect in this.
Wow. Well, what could be the other reason the DA is requesting a resentencing? The other
Well,
reason.
yeah. There are a couple other reasons, and this wasn't something that he mentioned, but something that a lot of people have talked about because there's a lot of controversy about this, as we know. But it's interesting to me that he's up for reelection, and there is
Uh,
a whole groundswell of support right now for these guys getting a resentencing. Kardashian's been involved in this. There's been a Netflix series that's just recently been released about this.
yep.
And so there is a whole group of people, even the family, even their family, the family of Jose and Kitty. There's a number of people who are part of the family that are all advocating. Even had a news press release where they were urging the DA to seek resentencing. So there's a groundswell of popularity. So there's some people saying that the reason he's making this statement so quickly and moving so quickly on this is that it would add to his reelection. Now, one thing I think, James, is that that's probably the worst reason in the world to to do this.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
mean, I don't think we can get to the place that we let popularity change laws. The legal stage of it. Now there's certainly and there's new evidence also that's come up, and that's
Right.
the fact that somebody else had been abused by the
Right.
father
Right.
as a young teenager, and two, that there was a letter that Erik had written prior to the killings that mentioned the sexual abuse. So,
Yep.
so there's some new evidence there on it, and there are uh, some indicators there that some people may say that would support resentencing. But I'd like to know what people are thinking out there in our audience.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'd
What?
like to know what you think. I mean, here's guys
Hmm.
savagely shot and killed their parents for a long time at the first trials and in both the trials.
Hmm.
For a long time, a lot of people thought that they were lying about this sexual abuse. That that this was just something the attorney helped him formulate on it, and that they weren't sexually abused, and they didn't believe it. But it looks like now that the evidence says they were sexually. But I guess the question is, if you were sexually abused and terribly emotionally abused, as maybe these guys were, is that a license to kill? And should should it be lenient in your prosecution or the sentencing of it?
Hmm.
And I'd like to know what people think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I would
You
too.
know,
Yeah. I
I
would
think
too.
that would be good. So we were going to encourage you to reach out with a shout out. Reach us, Charlie Crimebuster at gmail.com, Charlie Crimebuster at gmail.com. Tell us what you think. I'd love to see what people think. Maybe we could do another poll like we did
Yeah.
before
Let's do that.
and
They
see
can
what's
they can
going
they
on.
can, they can
Yeah,
do the YouTube poll, or they can also text us at four zero
right.
seven 917 2211. So
Exactly.
yeah, good. So what can we look for in the next episode, Charlie?
Well, I mentioned that it was extraordinary. It was not ordinary for a district attorney to say he wanted to resentence murders.
Mm-hmm.
But let me tell you something else that wasn't ordinary, and that is this particular trial. This trial, James, it took 7 years to get these guys convicted. 7 years to get these guys convicted. And then on top of that, it took two trials.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to open up and talk about the trials and talk about the path that took them from the crime that was committed all the way up to this point of where we are, where they're talking about resentencing. And it is a roller coaster for sure. In fact, James, this went all the way to the California Supreme Court.
Wow.
And we're going to talk all about that during our next episode podcast.
That sounds interesting. I'm looking forward to this one. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's good.
So, folks, we appreciate you listening to us tonight. James, it's always a joy to talk to you about these particular episodes that we have.
Likewise,
and
Charlie.
we always share a little something different on these episodes that they can get that they won't get out of the podcast.
That's right.
So I hope that folks will continue to subscribe, be part of our YouTube channel. We've got a lot of plans for this coming year of 2025. We're saying that 2025 is the year for Charlie Crimebuster to thrive.
There we go. All right. I like that.
We've even thought about doing some live stuff and some things down the line that we will be talking to our people about in the coming days. So until this time next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, stay safe, stay alert. Yep, for the life you save, it could be your very own.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. You can find additional podcasts at charliecrimebuster.com. You can also support our first responders, military, and law enforcement communities at peacemakernetwork.com or subscribe to our YouTube channel using tag @CharlieCrimebuster. Even visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/CharlieCrimebuster. Or if you would like to make suggestions for future podcasts, please send your ideas to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us next week for another exciting crime story with Charlie Crimebuster.